It begins, as so many heartbreaks do, with a key that no longer fits. Harold Whitman had been carrying the same brass key for 30 years. It was worn and dulled by time, the edges smoothed by the rhythm of 1,000 mornings. Unlocking the same oak door, stepping into the house he and his late wife Diana had built plank by plank, nail by nail, dream by dream. But on that gray Seattle afternoon, when the rain came down sideways and the gulls wheeled over the bay, Harold slid the key into the lock and it jammed. He turned it once, twice. Nothing. From the other side of the door, voices floated out. Laughter, the clink of glasses, music that wasn't his. And then, as if to punctuate the blow, his son Brandon opened the door holding a craft beer, his wife Vanessa right behind him with a smirk. "Dad," Brandon said too casually, "don't worry, we changed the locks. This is our space now." That was the hook. That was the crack in Harold's heart. The moment when decades of labor and love were treated like an old receipt, tossed aside without thought. Welcome to Family Shadows, where stories of fathers, families, and the quiet power of justice come to life. If you've ever felt the weight of sacrifice, if you've ever believed respect should not die with age, this is your place. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these stories that remind us of the values worth keeping. Today's story is titled, "They Changed the Locks on My House, but Forgot Whose Name Was on the Deed." Harold stood in the doorway, his raincoat dripping, his hands clutching the bag of cedar planks he had picked up at the lumber yard. He had planned to spend the evening in the garage, sanding and shaping wood for the rocking chair he promised to fix for his granddaughter Claire, once used as a girl. But his tools were nowhere in sight, and the laughter inside told him he was no longer standing at his home's threshold. He was at someone else's party. Vanessa leaned against the frame, her manicured hand brushing Brandon's arm. "We thought it was time for an upgrade," she said, her eyes sweeping over Harold's worn jacket and scuffed boots. "Fresh energy for the house. You know, make it our own." Harold didn't reply. His voice had always been more at home in silence than in confrontation. He looked past them into the living room. The photographs were gone from the wall, no trace of Diana's smile. No evidence of the children's drawings she once framed with pride. The old rug had been rolled up and replaced with something sleek and modern. Even the smell was different, no longer pine and lemon polish, but a waft of scented candles with names like Ocean Breeze and Midnight Jasmine. He took a slow breath, the kind a man learns after decades of swallowing words he knows will go unheard. Harold Whitman was 62. His hands were calloused, wide and thick from years of carpentry and boat repair. He had built half the decks in this town, patched more hulls than he could count. Neighbors still stopped him on the street with stories like, "Harold, that railing you fixed in '92 is still standing straight as ever." He had poured the same devotion into his house. Every beam told a story. The cedar staircase Diana had insisted on sanding herself. The kitchen shelves Harold had measured 3 times so Diana's cookbooks would fit just right. Together, they had made the house more than wood and nails. They had made it sacred. And now, with one turn of a lock, his own children had declared it theirs. Claire appeared from the kitchen, holding a tray of glasses. She froze when she saw her father standing there, dripping in the doorway. Her eyes widened, soft with something the others didn't show, remorse. "Dad," she whispered. But Brandon cut in quickly, his tone firm. "It's fine, Claire. Dad understands. He knows we need the space. We're just moving forward." Moving forward. The words rang in Harold's ears like a slammed door. To them, his memories were backward, his sacrifices outdated. Claire set the tray down, her hands trembling. She opened her mouth, but Vanessa's sharp glance silenced her. Harold stepped inside. He didn't ask permission, he didn't need to, but he felt like a stranger in his own living room. The couch was pushed against the opposite wall. The quilt Diana had hand-stitched was folded away, replaced with a sterile throw. "Dad," Brandon said, patting his father's shoulder too hard, too rehearsed. "This will be good for all of us. Fresh start, new energy." Harold nodded. His lips curved into something that looked like a smile but wasn't. Inside, he remembered Diana's last words, whispered to him on a spring morning before her heart gave out. "Take care of the home, Harold. It's where we live even after I'm gone." He had promised, and he had kept that promise until now. The rain outside intensified, tapping against the glass like impatient fingers. Harold sat on the edge of the armchair, his armchair, though it now held a bright new pillow Vanessa had bought. He didn't argue, he never had. Instead, he watched. He watched Brandon play host in what was once Harold's living room. He watched Vanessa sweep through the kitchen like a queen surveying her castle. He watched Claire retreat to the corner, her eyes darting to him with guilt. And he thought of all the nights he had stayed up late, paying bills, sanding floors, fixing leaks, so his children could grow up safe. He thought of Diana, who had never once asked for luxury, only warmth. The rain blurred the world beyond the window, but Harold's mind was clear. Something had shifted, something deep, something final. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the music had faded, Harold walked slowly through the rooms. His boots echoed on the hardwood. He paused at the hallway, where pencil marks once charted his children's heights year after year. They had been painted over. He opened the closet where Diana's coats once hung, empty. He stepped into the garage and stopped. His workbench was gone. His tools were stacked in plastic bins shoved against the wall where moisture seeped in through a crack in the concrete. The smell of mildew stung his nose. That was when it hit him. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't oversight. This was replacement. They weren't preserving the home, they were erasing it. Harold didn't shout. He didn't argue. He picked up one of the cedar planks he had carried in and set it against the damp wall. He ran his hand along its edge, feeling the promise of what it could become. A chair, a table, something useful, something lasting. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he saw Diana there, her hand on his, guiding him the way she always had. When he opened them again, the rain had slowed. The silence in the garage was thick, but within it, Harold heard a whisper, almost like his wife's voice. "It's still yours, Harold. Don't forget whose name is on the deed." He stood straighter. For the first time in a long time, Harold felt not old, not forgotten, but steady, solid. He turned off the light, stepped back into the house, and quietly resolved. This story wasn't over. The following Saturday, Harold arrived at the house just as the sun began to break through the clouds, throwing streaks of light across the neighborhood. For 3 decades, his routine had been simple. Pick up the morning paper, check the garden, fix whatever small thing was falling apart. He never thought he would need permission to walk through his own front door. But the sound that greeted him wasn't the quiet hum of a kettle or the creak of his rocking chair. It was music, loud, thumping, careless, and voices. Laughter that didn't belong to him. When he stepped inside, his boots barely touching the mat, he froze. The living room had been rearranged. The familiar armchairs were pushed against the far wall. A neon "Home Sweet Home" sign hung above the mantel where Diana's portrait once sat. Streamers were strung loosely from one corner to the other, the kind of decorations you bought in a pack from the party store. And in the center, Brandon lifted a glass of champagne. Vanessa stood beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. smiling broadly as though she had just won something. "To our new beginning," Brandon declared, his voice booming across the room. "Our space, our home." A cheer went up from the small crowd, friends from Vanessa's office, a couple of Brandon's buddies from college, faces Harold didn't recognize. They raised their glasses as though baptizing the house into a new life, one that had no room for the man who had built it. Harold lingered at the threshold, invisible. Claire was the first to notice him. She stood near the kitchen doorway, holding a tray of drinks. Her eyes widened when she saw her father, the color draining from her face. She hurried across the room, her voice low. "Dad, I didn't know they were doing this. I swear, I thought it was just a dinner." Harold offered her a small smile, the kind he had perfected, meant to reassure but carrying more sorrow than comfort. "It's all right, sweetheart." But it wasn't all right, not by a long stretch. Vanessa noticed him then. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Oh, Harold, you made it to his own house." Brandon turned, his grin faltering just for a second before he masked it with bravado. "Dad, come in, have a drink. We're just celebrating some changes, nothing big." Harold stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning every corner. The photographs were gone. The quilt Diana had sewn on their 20th anniversary had disappeared from the back of the couch. Even the rug, faded from years of footsteps, had been replaced with something modern, something soulless. "Changes," Harold repeated, his voice quiet. "Yes," Vanessa said, her tone sharp as if she had rehearsed it. "We need to bring this place into the present, make it fit our lifestyle. I mean, it's too big for one person anyway. Don't you think it's better this way?" Her words weren't framed as a question. They were a declaration, plain and cold. Claire's tray trembled in her hands. "Vanessa, maybe." But Brandon cut her off, raising his glass again. "It's a new era, Dad. You've done your part and we're grateful. Now it's our turn to shape the future." Grateful. The word stuck in Harold's chest like a splinter. If gratitude was what this looked like, he wondered what resentment would be. The room erupted in cheers again, laughter rising like smoke. But to Harold, the sound was muffled, distant. He could only hear the hollow echo of Diana's voice in his memory. Her laughter at their first housewarming, her joy when they could finally afford curtains for the front window, her whispered promise that this house would be their legacy. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. When he opened them, Claire was watching him with tears threatening to spill. She mouthed, "I'm sorry." Harold gave a small nod. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she wasn't to blame for the tide that had carried her brother and sister-in-law so far away from the values they were raised with, but he said nothing. Words had lost their weight in this house. Brandon clapped him on the back too hard. "Come on, Dad, lighten up. You'll get used to it. Think of it as evolution." Harold's gaze drifted toward the hallway. The pencil marks on the wall where he had measured his children's growth year after year had been painted over. Clean, blank, erased. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply stood in the midst of the celebration, the only one not raising a glass, the only one who understood what had truly been lost. And for the first time, Harold realized that the house was no longer simply under threat. It was already slipping from his hands piece by piece, replaced not with care but with conquest. He turned slowly, his boots heavy on the hardwood, and stepped out into the rain again. Behind him, the cheers swelled louder. Ahead of him, the sky stretched gray and endless, and Harold wondered how long a man could carry silence before it broke into something louder. The garage smelled different now. It had once been Harold's sanctuary, the place where sawdust floated like golden dust in the afternoon light, where the rasp of a hand plane was a hymn, where every shelf and nail told a story of work and care. It was here that Diana used to bring him coffee in a chipped mug, teasing him about the streaks of sawdust in his hair. It was here he had taught Brandon how to hold a hammer, steady and firm, and where Claire had built her first birdhouse with hands too small for the nails she bent. But when Harold pushed open the garage door that morning, what greeted him was not warmth or memory. It was dampness. The air was thick with mildew and the concrete floor glistened with a faint film of moisture. His workbench was gone. Not moved, gone. In its place were stacked plastic storage bins, the kind you bought in bulk at the hardware store. Labels scrawled across them in Vanessa's precise handwriting. Old tools. Misc. Dad's stuff. Harold crouched down, pulling one toward him. The lid resisted, snapping open with a crack. Inside lay the relics of his life, tossed together without care. His carpenter's square, the chisels he had sharpened by hand, the leather-bound notebook where he had kept sketches of boats he once dreamed of building. All of it pressed into a box, forgotten. He picked up the notebook, its cover softened by years of touch. When he opened it, the pages curled from the damp. Faint pencil lines marked plans for a small sailboat he and Diana once imagined they would take out on Lake Washington. He could almost hear her laugh again when she had said, "We'll name it the Whitman Dream, even if it never sails." His hands trembled as he closed the book. From the doorway, a voice cut through the stillness. "Dad," Vanessa said, her arms folded, her lips pursed as though she had caught him doing something shameful. "I told Brandon we needed to clear this place out. It was getting cluttered. Nobody uses these old things anymore." Harold straightened slowly, the notebook still in his hand. "These aren't just things," he said quietly. Vanessa shrugged, her tone dismissive. "We can't hold on to every piece of junk from the past. It's time for a clean slate. You of all people should understand that." The words struck him harder than he expected. Junk. She had called the tools of his trade, the memories of his marriage, the very symbols of his labor, junk. Harold lowered his eyes. For a moment he considered responding, telling her about the nights he had worked until his fingers bled, the weekends he had chosen sanding wood over fishing trips, the sacrifices Diana had made to keep this family afloat. But the silence inside him felt heavier, more eloquent. He only placed the notebook gently back into the bin, as if even within its exile it deserved respect. Claire appeared behind Vanessa, her voice soft, almost trembling. "Dad, I didn't know they put your things out here. I thought." Her eyes darted to her sister-in-law, then back to him. "I thought they were safe." Harold gave her a small smile, the kind meant to shield her from the sharpness of reality. "It's all right, Claire." But it wasn't, not at all. Vanessa stepped aside, glancing at her watch. "We're redecorating the garage too, thinking of turning it into a home gym. Brandon needs a space to train, and I'd love a yoga corner. These boxes can stay for now, but eventually." She let the sentence trail off, her meaning clear. Harold turned away, his gaze sweeping over the walls he had once lined with tools in neat rows. The hooks were empty, the shelves bare. The hum of life that had once filled this space had been stripped clean, replaced with an echo that belonged to strangers. He set the lid back on the bin and rose to his feet. His knees ached, a reminder of years bending and lifting, but his back remained straight. He looked at Vanessa, not unkindly, but with a calm that seemed to unsettle her. "These may not matter to you," he said softly, "but they mattered to your children's childhood and to their mother." For a flicker of a second, Vanessa shifted, her confidence cracking, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Well, times change." She left then, her heels clicking across the garage floor, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume, a smell that felt foreign, invasive in this sacred space. Claire lingered, her eyes wet. "Dad," she whispered, "what are you going to do?" Harold reached out, brushing the top of the bin as though blessing it. "I don't know yet," he admitted. His voice was low but steady. "But a house remembers, Claire, even when people forget." She bit her lip, nodding, though she clearly didn't understand. Then she slipped away, leaving Harold alone with the damp, the silence, and the boxes that now held his life. He remained there for a long time, the rain outside seeping through the crack in the concrete, the past pressed into plastic containers. And as he stood in the hollow shell of his garage, Harold realized something crucial. They weren't just boxing up his belongings. They were boxing up him. Dinner should have been a comfort. At least that was how Harold remembered it. When Diana was alive, evenings around the oak table had been sacred. It wasn't about the food, though her roast chicken was the kind of meal people remembered decades later. It was about the ritual. They talked about school projects, about the weather on the Sound, about nothing at all. They laughed, they argued, but it was family, bound together by the passing of dishes and the clink of silverware. Now, as Harold lowered himself into his chair, the same table felt foreign. The wood was the same, its grain still showing faint scratches from Brandon's fork when he was 10, from Claire's messy watercolor spill that Harold had never sanded away. But the atmosphere had shifted. The warmth had drained, replaced with something colder than the rain outside. Brandon carved the roast briskly, almost mechanically. Vanessa passed plates, her voice carrying a sharp edge even when she smiled. Claire sat quieter than usual, her fork moving but her eyes fixed on her lap. The silence stretched until Brandon cleared his throat. "Dad," he began, too casual, the way someone practiced a speech in front of the mirror, "we've been thinking." Harold set down his knife, waiting. "This house," Brandon's eyes flicked toward Vanessa, who gave a subtle nod. "It's too much for you, Dad. Big place, lots of upkeep. You shouldn't have to carry that burden at your age." Vanessa leaned forward, her smile thin. "We want what's best for you, Harold. There's a retirement community just 20 minutes from here. Beautiful grounds, full staff. You'd be comfortable, taken care of. No more stress." Harold said nothing. He looked at the roast cooling on his plate, the steam rising and fading. Claire's fork slipped, clattering against her plate. She flushed, then whispered, "He's fine here, aren't you, Dad?" But Brandon plowed on as if he hadn't heard. "It makes sense, Dad. We need to think long-term. This house doesn't fit your lifestyle anymore. It fits ours." The words hung heavy. "It fits ours." Harold lifted his eyes slowly until they met his son's. He saw no malice there, but something almost worse, certainty. Brandon truly believed what he was saying, as if this was reason, not theft. His gaze shifted briefly to Vanessa. Her expression carried no apology, only the smug satisfaction of someone who thought the deal already sealed. And then his eyes fell to Claire. She was trembling, her lips pressed tight as though holding back tears. Under the table, she reached across, her fingers brushing against his hand. A secret gesture, a daughter's quiet rebellion. Harold curled his fingers gently around hers, a fleeting squeeze of gratitude. Then he let go, because this was not a moment for protest. Not yet. He leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. He had learned long ago, working on boats in storms, that sometimes the wisest thing a man could do was not to fight the wave head-on, but to ride its pull, wait for the moment to steer. The conversation sputtered after that. Vanessa tried to lighten the mood with talk of remodeling the upstairs bathroom. Brandon spoke of a promotion at work. Claire stayed silent, pushing peas around her plate, but Harold heard none of it. His eyes drifted to the empty chair at the end of the table, Diana's chair. For 25 years she had anchored this family with kindness and firmness in equal measure. She would have known what to say now, how to pierce the tension without breaking the bond. Harold blinked hard. The chair was empty, but in his mind he saw her there still, her hand resting lightly on the table, her voice steady. "Don't let them forget, Harold. Don't let them forget what we built." The rest of the evening passed in fragments, dishes clinking, polite laughter that didn't reach the eyes, the scrape of chairs against the floor. When at last Harold excused himself, no one tried to stop him. He walked down the hall, his steps slow, pausing just once at the family photo that still hung near the staircase. It showed them all in younger years. Harold with his arm around Diana, Brandon with a gap-toothed grin, Claire holding her mother's hand. It was a moment frozen in joy. But the glass of the frame reflected Harold's present face, lined, weary, and alone. He touched the edge of the frame gently, almost like a farewell, then continued down the hall to his room. Behind him, the table still buzzed with conversation. Ahead of him, the silence of his bedroom waited. And in between, Harold carried the wound that no one had named aloud, the betrayal of being asked to surrender his life's work, not by strangers, but by the children it was built for. Sunday mornings had always belonged to Diana. Even after she passed, Harold kept the ritual alive. He would rise early, shave with care, button his flannel shirt all the way to the collar and drive the short distance to St. Luke's Chapel. The little church on the hill had watched the Whitman family grow for decades. Harold and Diana were married there. Brandon and Claire had been baptized under its vaulted ceiling. But now, as Harold sat in the back pew, the hymnals closed and his hands folded tight, he wasn't thinking of baptisms or blessings. He was thinking of locks changed without permission, of his workshop turned into plastic bins, of a dinner table turned tribunal. The choir's voices floated gently through the nave, but Harold barely heard them. His mind was a storm, swirling with words left unsaid. When the service ended, people lingered in the aisles, chatting about the weather, the Seahawks game, the bake sale next weekend. Harold slipped quietly toward the sacristy where Father Mitchell was gathering papers. The priest looked up and his face softened with recognition. "Harold, it's been a while." Harold nodded. "Yes, too long." Father Mitchell stepped closer, resting a hand on Harold's shoulder. "You look burdened, my friend." For a moment Harold couldn't speak. His throat worked, but no words came. He wasn't a man given to complaints. Silence had always been his armor, but armor grows heavy after a while. "They've taken the house, Father," Harold finally said, the words rough like splinters. The priest frowned. "What do you mean?" "They changed the locks," Harold explained, voice low. "Moved my things, told me it's theirs now, my son, my daughter-in-law. They say I should be in a retirement home." Father Mitchell's eyes closed briefly as though in silent prayer. Then he opened them and said, "That house is your life's work, Harold, and your sanctuary. No one has the right to strip that from you." Harold gave a weary smile. "Try telling them that." The priest studied him for a long moment. "You've given them so much, but sometimes love becomes twisted into expectation. It doesn't mean you must surrender what is yours. You have a responsibility, not just to yourself, but to Diana's memory." At her name, Harold's chest tightened. He thought of her laughter in the kitchen, her steady hand on his arm when he doubted himself. She would never have allowed anyone to diminish him this way. Father Mitchell's voice grew firmer. "You must stand, Harold, quietly but firmly. You owe them the truth of who you are." Harold nodded, the words sinking deep. That afternoon, after leaving the chapel, Harold didn't drive straight home. Instead, he steered his old Ford truck downtown, parking in front of a small law office tucked between a bakery and an insurance agency. The gold letters on the door read, "Harper and Associates, Real Estate Law." Inside, the reception area smelled faintly of coffee and paper. A young assistant led him into a modest office where Ms. Harper sat behind a desk stacked with files. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed but not unkind. "Mr. Whitman," she said, extending her hand. "What can I do for you?" Harold hesitated. Speaking the truth out loud made it all the more real, but then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded deed. The paper was creased from years of storage, the ink slightly faded, but the name stood clear, Harold Whitman. "They think it's theirs now," he said simply, "but this says otherwise." Ms. Harper studied the document, nodding slowly. "You're the sole owner, no transfer, no co-signer. Legally, it's yours." Harold exhaled, the relief almost painful. Ms. Harper leaned back in her chair. "They can redecorate, they can even live there if you allow it, but they cannot remove you. And they certainly cannot replace you. If they've changed the locks without your consent, that's unlawful." Her words felt like the first ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "What should I do?" Harold asked. "First," she said, "gather documentation. Deed, utility bills, anything that ties you to ownership. Then, if necessary, we serve them with a notice to vacate. But more than that, Mr. Whitman," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "You need to decide what legacy you want this house to carry. Is it simply a place, or is it something more?" Harold's mind returned to Diana, to her hands guiding his across wood grain, to her whisper about the house being their legacy. He knew the answer, though it sat heavy in his chest. "It's more," he said. Ms. Harper gave a small smile. "Then let's make sure it remains that way." She began explaining the process, titles, deeds, trusts. Harold listened carefully, though the legal language was foreign to him. But one phrase lodged itself firmly in his heart: trust. Ms. Harper explained it gently. "A trust allows you as the grantor to protect your assets. You can set terms, define who benefits and under what conditions. It means your house won't be at the mercy of anyone's entitlement. It will serve the purpose you decide." Harold leaned back, letting the idea settle. A trust, protection, direction, quiet justice. By the time he left the office, the rain had returned, slicking the sidewalks in silver, but Harold's steps were steadier than they had been in weeks. He carried the deed in his pocket like a shield, and for the first time since the lock jammed in his hands, he felt something rising inside him, not anger, not vengeance, but resolve. The storm was gathering, yes, but it would be his storm. The envelope was heavier than it looked. Harold carried it tucked under his arm as he stepped out of Ms. Harper's office and into the drizzle. Inside were copies of the deed, a list of recommended actions, and the first draft of a notice to vacate. He hadn't decided yet when, or even if, he would use it, but having it, knowing he wasn't powerless, gave him a steadiness he hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time, Harold drove home without dread. The old Ford rumbled along the wet streets, wipers squeaking against the windshield. He wasn't smiling, but his jaw had unclenched, his hand steady on the wheel. But peace, like so many fragile things, didn't last long. Brandon was waiting. The moment Harold stepped through the door, he saw his son pacing the living room, his phone in one hand, his face flushed with anger. Vanessa sat on the couch, arms crossed, watching like a hawk. Claire lingered by the staircase, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Where were you?" Brandon demanded. Harold set his coat on the rack unhurried. Downtown. Don't play coy with me. Brandon's voice cracked. You were at a lawyer's office. Vanessa's friend saw you going in. What the hell, Dad? Harold turned, meeting his son's eyes, calm, steady. I went to see MS, Harper. Brandon's hand tightened around his phone. Why? Why would you drag some lawyer into this? We're family. We can handle this ourselves. Vanessa leaned forward, her tone sharp. Unless you're planning something against us, are you Harold? The question carried venom, but Harold didn't flinch. He moved slowly toward his armchair, though Vanessa had tried to replace the cushions, and sat down, resting his hands on his knees. I needed clarity, he said evenly. I wanted to know where I stand. Brandon laughed bitterly. Where you stand, you're old, Dad. You don't need all this space. We've already started making this house ours. You think some piece of paper changes that? Harold leaned forward slightly. His voice was quiet, but the kind of quiet that made people listen. It's not just a piece of paper, it's the deed, and my name is still on it. For a moment, the room froze. Vanessa's lips tightened. Brandon's jaw worked as if chewing words he couldn't swallow. Claire shifted on the stairs, her hands gripping the railing. Dad, Brandon said, lowering his voice but not his fury, you're being selfish. We've done everything to make this house better, to modernize it, to give it a future. And you want to cling to the past, to junk, to memories that don't pay the bills. Harold's gaze didn't waver. Memories built this house. Every board, every nail, every paycheck I brought home, every meal your mother cooked, those weren't junk. They were the foundation. And you wouldn't have a single bill to pay if not for what Diana and I gave you. Brandon's face flushed deep red. So what, you're going to throw us out after everything, after all the years Years you what? Harold's voice sharpened, cutting through his son's tirade. Years you lived here rent-free. Years you let your mother cook for you, let me cover the mortgage, the repairs, the taxes. He rose slowly, his height imposing though his frame had aged. You mistake generosity for obligation, Brandon, and entitlement for right. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. Vanessa finally spoke, her tone cold as steel. If you go through with this, whatever this legal stunt is, you'll lose us. Do you understand? You'll lose your family. Harold looked at her, then at his son. His voice softened, almost mournful. No, Vanessa. If this is what family has become, I've already lost you. Claire gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Her eyes shone with tears, torn between loyalty to her father and fear of the fracture widening before her. Brandon took a step forward, fists clenched, but Harold didn't move. The steadiness in his father's eyes made him falter. There was no rage there, no weakness either, only a resolve he couldn't dent. Finally, Brandon muttered, "You'll regret this." Harold shook his head. "I've regretted many things in my life. Standing for my home will not be one of them." He turned then, walking toward the hallway. The envelope still lay on the entryway table, heavy with truth. He didn't pick it up, not yet, but its presence was a promise that the storm was no longer gathering, it was here. It was Claire who insisted on the meeting. "Dad," she had whispered to him after the confrontation in the living room, "if we keep going like this, it'll just be shouting in hallways. We need to sit down, all of us. One table." Harold didn't answer right away, but he nodded. He understood. A storm only clears when it's faced head-on. So a few days later they gathered in the dining room, the same oak table where Diana once served Sunday suppers, where laughter had rung out in younger years. Now it felt like a courtroom, the air stiff with tension. Brandon sat at the head, Vanessa beside him, her arms folded, lips pressed tight. Claire sat across from them, her hands clenched in her lap. Harold stood for a long moment before pulling out his chair, his posture steady, his face calm. The silence stretched until Brandon broke it. "All right," he said, voice clipped. "Let's get this over with. What exactly are you planning, Dad?" Harold didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into the envelope he had placed on the table. He laid out the first document with deliberate care. The paper was old, but the ink was clear, the letters bold. "The deed," Harold said simply. "It bears one name, mine." Brandon frowned, leaning forward. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "This house was built by my hands, paid for by my labor," Harold continued, his voice steady. "Every beam, every payment, every repair done by me and your mother. And the law recognizes that, not wishes, not entitlement, the law." Brandon's jaw tightened. "So you went through all this just to throw that in our faces?" Harold didn't flinch. "No, I went through this because you changed the locks on me. Because you boxed up my life in the garage. Because you told me I belonged in a retirement home. You forced this." The room was so quiet, Harold could hear the clock ticking in the hall. Then he reached into the envelope again, pulling out another document. He laid it down gently, sliding it toward Brandon. "These," Harold said, "are reports of safety and code violations. The changes you made, unpermitted electrical work, blocking ventilation, storing flammable materials improperly, they put this house and anyone inside it at risk." Vanessa's face went pale. What are you talking about?" "MS. Harper had an inspector walk through," Harold said calmly. "What you've done here isn't just careless, it's unlawful." Brandon's hand slammed against the table. "This is ridiculous. You're blowing things out of proportion." "No." Harold's voice cut through, sharper than his children had ever heard it. "You blew this out of proportion when you tried to erase me from my own home." He stood then, his frame tall despite the years, his eyes fixed on his son. "I am serving notice. You and Vanessa are to vacate this property, legally, immediately." The words landed heavy, like a gavel striking wood. Brandon's face contorted with fury. "You can't do this. You're my father. This house." "This house," Harold interrupted, "is not a trophy you inherit by demand. It is not a stage for your ego. It is not yours to claim because you want it. It is mine. And if you had shown it the respect it deserved, perhaps we could have shared it. But you chose entitlement over gratitude. And entitlement has no place here." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Claire's eyes brimmed with tears. She looked from her father to her brother, torn in two. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, her bravado cracking. Harold softened his gaze when it met Claire's. "This isn't about taking away. It's about preserving what your mother and I built, and making sure it doesn't die in selfish hands." His words lingered like the echo of a hymn. Finally, Brandon pushed back his chair, the scrape harsh against the floor. He stood, his fists clenched, but he said nothing. His face was red, his breathing ragged. He stormed out of the room, Vanessa hurrying after him. Claire remained seated, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Dad," she whispered. Harold walked slowly to her side, placing a hand gently over hers. It had to be said. She nodded, though her heart was breaking. As Harold gathered the documents back into the envelope, his movements deliberate and calm, he felt something he hadn't in weeks. Not victory, not triumph, but clarity. Justice didn't need to be loud. Sometimes it only needed a steady voice and the truth laid bare on a table. The house was quieter than it had been in years. Not because it was empty. Brandon and Vanessa had already moved out, their boxes gone, their laughter and arguments faded. No, the quiet now felt different. It was not the silence of neglect or exile. It was a calm silence, a space breathing again after being stifled. Harold walked slowly through each room. The oak table stood where it always had. The walls, though stripped of photographs, still held the faint outlines of memories. The marks where a picture frame had once hung, the groove in the wood where Diana's chair had rocked too close. Even in its barest state, the house carried echoes of life that could not be erased. He paused in the living room, setting down the envelope of documents on the mantel. He didn't need them now. Their work was done. The law had spoken, but more importantly, he had spoken for himself, for Diana, for the home they had built. A week later, Harold met a young couple at the front steps. They were in their late 20s with a toddler balanced on the father's hip and a second baby on the way. Their eyes lit up as they stepped inside, not with greed, not with entitlement, but with wonder. "It's beautiful," the young woman whispered, brushing her hand across the wooden banister. "It feels alive," her husband added. Harold smiled softly. "It's meant to be lived in, respected." They nodded, and in their faces Harold saw something he had feared lost: gratitude. By the end of the month, the house had new tenants. Harold didn't sell it outright. Instead, he arranged with MS. Harper to rent it under terms that ensured its care, and with the income he set aside funds for something bigger. At St. Luke's Chapel, Harold stood with Father Mitchell as they unveiled a plaque. The Diana Whitman Hands Foundation, supporting young apprentices in the woodworking trades. It wasn't grand, it wasn't flashy, but it was lasting. Each year, a handful of students would receive tools, training, and a chance to build something with their own hands, just as Harold once had, just as Diana had encouraged. When Claire attended the small ceremony, she wept openly. "Mom would be so proud," she said. Harold nodded, his own eyes wet. She always believed in building more than just walls and roofs. She believed in building people. That evening, Harold returned to the boathouse by the water's edge. The air smelled of cedar and salt, the gulls wheeling against a sky streaked with sunset. He sat on a stool, a piece of wood in his lap, his hands moving in slow, steady strokes with a plane. The house no longer echoed with his children's voices, but it carried something deeper, a purpose, a future. Diana's laughter lived there still, not in photographs or quilts, but in the legacy now protected. Harold leaned back, the soft light warming his face. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying silence as a burden. He was carrying it as peace. And so, Harold Whitman discovered what many fathers before him have learned: that ownership is not about control or entitlement, but responsibility and love. A house can be stripped of its photos, its locks, even its laughter, but it cannot be stripped of the spirit in which it was built. And that spirit, when honored, becomes a legacy. Dear friends, thank you for listening to this story on Family Shadows. From our family to yours, we wish you good health, warmth, and the strength of true family bonds. May your homes always be filled with respect, kindness, and love. Please consider subscribing so you never miss the next story, and together, let us keep these lessons alive. Until next time, may you and your family be blessed with peace and happiness.